All right, hello and welcome to another KeyShot webinar. As always, a recording of this webinar will be available to view at any time on keyshot.com/learning and youtube.com/keyshot3d. So in case you weren't aware of these resources, we have a bunch of quick tips, webinars, tutorials all uploaded here. And as we get close to the release of KeyShot 6, we will be updating these with new and relevant information. And you can always register for the webinar as well from the learning page. As you can see here, we've had some issues with the newsletter recently where some people have not received it. So in case that is the case for you, you can register here. All right, well, my name is Rex Roberts, and I'm the lead user experience designer here at the Luxion US headquarters in Tustin, California. And as the webinar title suggests, today I'll be discussing and demonstrating the uses and benefits of procedural textures in KeyShot. As you can see, I'm using KeyShot 6 Beta Pro. But many of these same principles that I'll be discussing today apply to KeyShot 5 as well. If there's anything that stands out as a KeyShot 6 only feature or a KeyShot Pro feature, I'll do my best to point that out to you guys so there's no confusion on features. So to start things off, I will give a quick introduction to procedural textures, what they are, how they work. Keep it pretty basic, and then I'll show some example scenes of how procedural textures were used in KeyShot to add some realism, some spice to your image. And then I'll set up this scene here pretty much from scratch. I'll have some basic materials applied, but show how the procedural textures were all applied here. And some of this stuff can only be done in KeyShot 6 using the material graph. So I'll try and kind of save that stuff till the end and keep it more general for the first half. Okay, so I'll just pause this scene, let it sit in the background. And here is our procedurals.bip. This is an example of some different procedural types, and any KeyShot 5 or KeyShot 6 beta user will have this scene available to them in their resources file. So on Windows, that's located in your documents. Let's go to my documents folder, KeyShot 6 or KeyShot 5, and in the scenes folder, you'll find this procedurals.bip. So you can open this up and play around with it a little bit as I'm going through some of these examples and explaining what procedural textures are. So what is a procedural texture? Let's go in and edit this. This advanced wood we have here, and we see a lot of parameters, some more advanced than others. In particular, this wood is quite advanced, has a lot of different features and parameters. So a procedural texture is essentially a computer-generated image. We can see a thumbnail of the mesh polygon here, of the camouflage procedural here. And all these parameters you see essentially act as variables in the algorithms that create these computer-generated images or procedural textures. So the benefit, or what I see as the main benefit of procedural textures, is that they're fully interactive. You can make adjustments to these textures and they all update live in real time. So also one of the main benefits of using KeyShot is seeing all those changes update in real time. And just like with KeyShot in the real-time render, we can see those texture changes update, and there's no need to take these textures into Photoshop or an image editing software and make adjustments to them there, because we can make all the adjustments just right here inside of KeyShot. So to be honest, with all these advanced parameters, some of the procedural textures do take some playing around with to get the desired results. But the important thing is to know, what they're capable of and how you can potentially use them in your scene. So ideally, the procedural textures will help improve your efficiency by removing the need to go into an image editing application such as Photoshop and do all your texturing here. In addition to that, there's no extra files or image files necessary to be included with your scene, so you don't have to worry about maybe losing a texture after moving your scene, or if you're sharing a KSP, it'll be smaller because you're not actually sharing those textures because they're all contained inside of KeyShot. So where do we find procedural textures in KeyShot? Well, we can start in the library. We do have some pre-created procedurals, such as a cloth weave, or the brushed metals were created with procedural textures. But if we wanted to create a procedural from scratch, let's just remove our camouflage here. So let's say we have a basic material. Maybe this is plastic, glossy plastic, and we can find those procedural textures in the Textures tab. And when you have one of your texture thumbnails selected, under this texture drop-down here, you'll find the list of 2D and 3D textures. So we do have a lot here. The animation, those items are only in KeyShot 6, so KeyShot 5 users will not see those. And also the occlusion procedural is new for KeyShot 6. I didn't mention before, but if anyone is currently on a registered KeyShot 5 license, you can submit a request to become a part of the beta testing team. Just send an email to beta@luxion.com and we can get you set up with KeyShot 6 beta before it's released for you to test out for yourself. Okay, so from this list, we can simply select our procedural texture, and that will become applied to our part. And then we're ready to start modifying the parameters and find what works best for each scenario. In KeyShot 6, we can also texture items from the properties page. So let's say we wanted to texture roughness. We don't actually see that roughness parameter here in our textures page, but we can find the button here in the properties, right-click, and from the textures flyout, we can select that texture here. So brand new for KeyShot 6 is the ability to apply roughness maps, as you can see. And these can create some pretty cool effects. I really like using this camouflage procedural for the roughness map. It has this spray option, which adds some fall off to the edges, and this is a nice way to create some worn looks on your parts. And then the roughness values are controlled by the color values. So black is going to be totally glossy, where white is a roughness value of 1. So if you noticed in the list, there are 2D textures and 3D textures. So these behave a little differently. They're both procedural textures, but the 2D textures require traditional mapping types. So in this example here, I've used the mesh polygon and simplify it a little bit. So when you first apply this mesh polygon, the first step is to take a look at the mapping type. What's cool about the 2D procedurals is that they're very flexible. In this case, I use the cylindrical mapping type because I know that that will create a pinch in the center, and that was used to create the kind of life preserver effect here. So then once we have that applied, we can start adjusting our parameters. Here I'm adjusting the spacing to bring the mesh together on the vertical axis to kind of mimic that striped effect here. So with the 2D procedural textures, you have the option to set your different mapping types, and that makes them flexible. But it does mean that you might have some seams. So, for example, the cloth weave, we have this as a box map. And if we zoom in, we can see there are some seams created where each of the faces of the box are meeting each other. So, not totally ideal, but for cases like this cloth weave where the scale is going to be a lot smaller, then those seams become difficult to see and not a big deal. The benefit of using the 3D procedurals is that there's no need to use those traditional mapping types. So an example of a 3D procedural is this wood, and you can think of this essentially as a stone block. And as you start carving away at that stone block, you'll see the texture projected throughout the entire object. So let's say this was a granite, and we were carving out a granite statue out of our block here. As we do so, these granite fractals will be projected entirely through the object, so you'll never actually see any kind of seams when using the 3D procedurals. So if we go back to the wood advanced and increase our scale, all we need to do is open up the mapping tool, and we're essentially just positioning our texture on the object. So we can use the mapping tool itself to move and rotate and scale. Sometimes for the wood, you don't want it to be perfectly centered. Give it a little more interest to get some offset of your rings and your grain. You can also just use the position tool to select where you want that center point to be on your model. Okay, so let's open up some more interesting examples here besides just blocks. So in our skateboard scene, I actually have this modeled background in here, modeled backplate, and I used procedural textures to create that. So let me open up this scene. And here this looks like I just have a backplate applied, but it's actually just a plane that I assigned a procedural noise texture to get this effect. So I have a color gradient which gives this vignetting effect, and I can adjust the color of this however I want. So you can really get creative with the procedural textures and use them in other ways besides just adding some realism to your models. Like in this case, I've actually created a very flexible backplate that I can use in a variety of scenes. I can adjust the scale of the noise and also adjust that gradient map. Okay. The next example I want to show here are some sunglasses. So in this scene, we have two procedural textures being used. One is the circular mesh, as you can see here, and then we also have a gradient on the lenses. So let's just remove those textures and kind of set those up from scratch. All right, let's start with the ground texture. So you can use the procedurals to add some interest to your ground. One of our users, Tim Fayer, who works for Chrysler in the automotive industry, I see him using this technique a lot. Sometimes he'll add like a glass material and add a fractal bump or a noise texture bump there to add some interest and give some interest to the reflections in the ground. But yeah, in this case, we just want to create a simple mesh. So I'll go back to my metallic paint, and under the Textures tab, select the Opacity button, and in the drop-down, I will select Mesh Circular. So you can see it's already applied. The first thing that I like to do is adjust the scale, make sure I'm seeing all those little holes clearly. Using the slider, sometimes you'll reach a maximum, but always keep in mind you can type in a value larger than what the slider allows. So that looks like a good size for me. And then we'll kind of start from the top down. So our opacity mode looks good as color. We can invert that. In this case, there's no alpha to our texture because we're using this procedural. So we'll use that as the color opacity mode. As far as mapping, scale is the most important parameter in this case. And then we can set our colors. So we have white is defining fully opaque, and black is defining fully transparent. So we'll leave those how they are. And then in the lattice section, we can add some angle to our holes here. So pick a nice even angle. And then we have the spacing options. Then under shape, you can control the radius, the size of each of those holes in the mesh. And it looks like the holes are a little tighter in one direction than the other. So to fix that, I'll just go into my lattice and bring that down a little bit. So as we make these changes, they're all adjusting interactively in real time. So yeah, there are a lot of parameters. I won't be able to go through each and every one of these, but have some fun at home and play around to find what works best for your scenario. We can also add a bump to our mesh texture. To do that, I'll just hold Alt, click on that thumbnail button, and drag over to bump. And let's zoom in a little bit to see what our effect is here. We have just a very subtle, soft edge, but I want to make that a little sharper. So let's reduce the fall off from our opacity map. And then you can see that these textures are synced by default when copying them over. But for the bump, I want to adjust the radius of these holes just a little bit. So I'll unsync that to make sure I'm not making changes to the opacity map. Very important to be aware of sync when working with multiple textures on a single material. Okay, so then on our bump map, I can increase my radius a little bit, add some fall off. An awesome feature in KeyShot 6, this is the material graph. Inside the material graph, you can make a selection of a node and preview the color, the alpha, and the bump. So we'll just look at the color of this node, so it'll make it a little easier for us to make adjustments here. And then we can toggle that off. So now let's add our gradient procedural to the lenses. Here I have a metal material because I want that high reflectivity that you see on some of those cool colored lenses. So we'll go into our Textures tab, select the color swatch, and select Color Gradient. And just like we did for the mesh, we can preview the color to make it a lot easier for us to set this up. So here in the gradient tool, we have some options for gradient type. And I'll just set this to spherical. And then open up the mapping tool to center that gradient between our two lenses here. We need a little more contrast in our colors to see what's going on. So if you ever get to a point where you can't find exactly where your texture is, like here I'm moving this mapping tool around, but I'm not seeing that transition. So a good way to find that is just use the position tool and click somewhere on your model. In this case, the center point would be between the two lenses here, but since this is a different material, I can't quite use that as a reference point. So then here, let's just assign some colors from the library. So maybe a green on the edges. And a pink. So then we can adjust the scale. Type in a value larger than the slider allows. And then use our mapping tool to further position that. Okay, so I'm still in my color preview here. I can just turn that off. And now we have a nice color gradient. We can just go in to the gradient tool and use our color swatches to quickly swap those out to see some color variations. All right. So let's take a look at the noise procedural, well, the two different noise procedurals to see the effects we can use with them. So in this case, I have a noise texture assigned to the pool here just to add some surface imperfections. So if I remove that, you can see it's just a little too perfect. I want to add some imperfections and inconsistencies in the surface there. So for that kind of thing, I'll use the noise fractal or the noise texture. The fractal will have some sharper edges, little more high contrast values. So I'll compare the fractal and the texture noise to, like, the fractal would be, your ocean surface where the water has a lot of surface disruption, where the noise texture is a little softer, more like a bathtub or a still body of water. So I think the fractal noise is a little intense for this kiddie pool. So I'll change this to the noise texture and increase the scale, find a value that's subtle. And then for our water here, we've added some realism the same way with the noise texture. If we hide that, you can see there's no distortion in this label that we've placed on the bottom. So then as we add that noise texture and increase the scale, we start getting that nice distortion. All right, the next example is more on the engineering side of things. So here we had a couple products that customers sent over to us, and when they imported them into KeyShot, they wanted to see a little more realism. So they sent some example images of what the real object looks like, and we have some color changes due to the manufacturing, little bit of noise in the metal there. We have a radial brushed effect on this part. And then this other part had this kind of noise, fractal noise texture here. So as you can see, I used the color gradient to add this kind of heat treated effect. So you can add as many stops as you want to the color gradient, and this allowed me to add some discoloration to these different parts to add some realism. And then for this guy, we added the radial brushed texture. So I'll remove that for now and remove the color texture so we can see it a little better. So we have two options for brushed textures. We have the brush 2D and the brush 3D, which is the radial texture. Brush 2D, you're using, like I said, the traditional mapping types. So this is good for appliances, say stainless steel refrigerator. The 2D brushed is great for that, but in this case we want a radial brush texture. So the first thing I do, if I can't really see where my texture is here, I'll pump up the bump height. Usually that helps define it a little bit. So now I'm able to see it some more. We'll open up the mapping tool to make sure that it's centered properly. So we do have it centered in our part, but with this texture, the center of the circles will be on the y-axis. So if we open up our coordinate legend, we can see that the y-axis is this represented by the green arrow. And what we want to do is just rotate our mapping tool so that green arrow is aligned in the direction that we want those circles to be. And then we can make adjustments through all our parameters here. And in KeyShot 6 Pro, as I mentioned before, you have that option to preview those textures, and this feature really helps setting up the procedurals, making sure they're placed correctly. And then that other object here was just a simple cast part, and again use the noise fractal to add some surface interest. And again, the beauty of these procedurals is that you can adjust that scale, you can adjust the parameters, and see all those updates changing in real time. Okay, so that's it for the examples I have. Before I move on to the skateboard scene, Sean, are there any questions that I can answer? Okay, cool. All right, so let's open up our skateboard scene. Oh wait, there's one more example I wanted to show. This was a cool one from Andy Jones, who was on last month's webinar, and he used the procedural spots texture to create this bokeh effect. He posted this on the forum and everybody was in awe. So essentially what he did was import some planes at varying distances from his object. Of course, those planes should be perpendicular to the camera. And he assigned the spots procedural as an opacity map to those planes to give that effect that you see here. So that's pretty simple. We could set that up. Let's open up one of our examples. We'll just do it for the sunglasses. Okay, so we can go up to our edit menu and add a plane. Grab that plane. See, it's pretty small there, so increase the scale and use our move tool to get the basic position of that. Square to our camera. Okay, then maybe I'll set this to an emissive material and then go into my textures and under opacity grab the spots and start making adjustments to set up the mapping. So let's see, increase the density, increase the scale, or maybe decrease. There we go. Okay. So we'll set then our inside color to white because we want those to be opaque, and the outside color to black. Then we can even add some fall off to those. And then as you layer these planes, so if I were to duplicate this and move it out, I could adjust the scale and have some varying sizes of the spots. And you know, this isn't the ideal scene for something like this, but I think you get the point that the procedurals can be very flexible. You can get really creative with them to create some cool results, and in this case, some interesting effects. Okay. All right, so let's move on to the skateboard. Oh, here we have this guy opened up already, but I'm going to start kind of from scratch here. Okay, so I just have some basic materials applied, diffuse, plastic, metals. So these were all just standard materials from the library that I drag and dropped onto each of these parts. Just so this is a little faster to work with, I'm going to go into performance mode to disable some of those self shadows, ground shadows, that kind of thing. And I just saw there was a question from Alan Bankston. He asked if there was a way to add materials to selective surfaces without having to break up the part before importing into KeyShot. So KeyShot 6 makes it very easy. In this case, I have a skateboard deck, so I'll just show this deck only, and that's one single part that was brought in as an OBJ. And there's an awesome new tool in KeyShot 6 Pro, which is the geometry editor. So I'll just open up my geometry view window. This is also a KeyShot 6 Pro only feature. So here I have a secondary viewport where I can change this to a different camera. In the case of positioning those planes in the glasses scene I just had up, the geometry view is very helpful to move those planes around, move your physical lights around without disrupting your view in the real time. But another tool we offer in the geometry view is the geometry editor. So I can just select this part and edit the geometry. And we have a few different options here. We can split the surfaces. So this is what Alan was referring to. We can split separate objects, edit normals, and close holes in open meshes. So in this case, we'll split the object surfaces. Then inside the geometry view, just make a selection of the surface that we want to split. So in this case, I want to create some grip tape on the skateboard. So we'll have to split that top surface. But as you can see, I made a selection and the whole deck is actually being selected. So what we'll want to do is adjust our splitting angle, or we do have the option to split by individual polygons, but as you can see, there are a lot. That would take a long time. So we can just split by an angle, and as we adjust this value, we can see the surfaces updating, or the selection updating in the geometry view. So if we increase this value, you can see it then starts wrapping over the edge. So it looked like 5 was a good value. We have that surface just being split right before the deck wraps around. Okay, so then we'll split that object and then we can preview it here before finalizing. We have that top surface split out. I'll also want to split the bottom surface as well for the graphic. So we'll use the same technique here, just select that bottom surface. Again, a splitting angle of 5 looks good, and split object and click done. So now that we have, now we can look in our scene tree, and this deck has now been split into 3 different objects. So if you do this, it does affect live linking. You won't be able to use your KeyShot plugins to live link with your CAD software, but a very helpful tool for, say, marketers or people who don't have access to the CAD data. You can actually split out those surfaces all inside of KeyShot 6 Pro. Okay, so let's continue on and add some grip tape to the deck here. So again, we have this top surface is already split, so I can set a custom material here. I can grab a material from the library. Maybe we just want a rough black plastic. Just drag and drop it on there so you can see now that that top surface is split. But yeah, it's still looking a little dull. So we need to add a bump map here to create kind of that sandpaper effect on the grip tape. So just like some of the examples I showed before, I'll be using the noise, one of the noise textures. In this case, we'll use the fractal because we do want some sharper edges. Again, I like to increase the bump height just so I can see what's going on. I do recommend keeping the bump height value at or below 1. Once you start going higher than 1, then you start sometimes losing some definition. You could run into some issues. In this case, it looks okay, but I suggest keeping it at a value of 1 or lower. So here we just want to decrease our scale, and already, we get a nice texture starting to look like some grip tape. So here we use the fractal noise to add some sharp bump, sharp roughness, but it still looks a bit flat. So of course we can make adjustments to our lighting. We just have a DOSH environment applied here. This environment will be included in KeyShot 6 along with some other DOSH content that they've provided to us. But yeah, I want to create a little more interest, and I'll do that by assigning a color texture or diffuse texture. And in this case, I'll use the noise texture. So this gives me a little softer transition than we saw with the fractal. And we'll just increase the scale until we get kind of this subtle effect. So here we have some patches of light and dark. And then the base color, which in this case is color 2, I'll set as black. And then we can just set our color 1 as gray. So we get some very subtle variation in color on the surface. And now it's starting to look like somebody's actually been riding this board. All right. So yeah, that's good for the grip tape, I would say. Let's move along. Yeah. Yes, that's correct. So the question was, does the split object surfaces work with NURBS models? And the answer is no. If you do have an object that includes NURBS, then the objects or the surfaces that you split will still be there when you're not in NURBS mode. So let's say this skateboard deck had NURBS, so I can get those real smooth curves here. In this case, we've split the object and we see those split surfaces while we're not in NURBS mode, but if I were to switch into NURBS mode, then we would lose that separation and it would go back to that single object. So another thing to be aware of when using the split surfaces option and the edit geometry option. So the live linking becomes, that link is lost if you're using a plugin, and then also the link between NURBS and your mesh surfaces will be lost. But as long as you import that object at a high enough tessellation, then no need for the NURBS surfaces. Okay, so let's move on to the wood and the trucks. So I'll pop this guy on its side. So we'll just open up the move tool, and I can hold shift to snap in 15-degree increments, snap to ground, and then I'll just rotate it a little more. Just so those the ends of the truck are resting realistically on the ground. Okay, so we have our basic wood materials in the library, which use the traditional texture maps. which are nice, but sometimes you want to have a little more control. I'm going to link this bottom surface to the board here, or to this edge, so we can see now, since we're using this traditional texture map with a box mapping type, you see the seam along the edge there. So that's not ideal. In this case, we can use the wood procedural to avoid getting those seams and to get some cool results. So with the diffuse texture selected, we'll go down and select Wood Advanced. So you can see the center of our tree is centered on the board itself. But in the case of a skateboard, you have the plies that run lengthwise along the board. So I'll try and use the mapping tool to get as close to that as we can. So I'll just open up the mapping tool, and just like that radial brush texture, we have the y-axis is aligned with, you can think of it as the center of the tree. So we want these rings to run lengthwise, so I'll just rotate my mapping tool. Can use Shift to snap. So now we have the rings being aligned in the correct direction to kind of mimic those plies on the board. So there are a lot of options for the Wood Advanced Procedural. In this case, I'll bring down my ring noise, which produces some variations within the rings, and we'll bring down the axial noise to bring down kind of that waviness, and then open up the mapping tool again just to make some adjustments to see if we can get these rings to align along the edge. So as I move this up or down, we can see that texture all updating live in real time. I think I'm going to bring down the scale a little bit and try that again. So that'll be good enough for now. We have the plies running in generally the correct direction. Okay, so we set up our grip tape with some noise textures. We have our deck with the Wood Advanced Procedural. So let's move on to the trucks. To make it a little faster, I'll show only this part. And I want to add some surface imperfections. So I'll add a bump map. And again, the noise fractal. As you can see, this is one of my go-to procedural textures. Highly flexible, highly versatile. So in this case, let's see, I'll bring down the levels to kind of see how this texture is created. So we have these little wave forms. As you increase the levels, you kind of get this layering effect of those waves. But I don't want this texture to be all the way across my model, so I can control that with the fall off. And as I increase that fall off value, you can see that it starts to be more sparsely applied to the surface. We can increase the bump height there to get a little better view. So yeah, now we get this cool kind of imperfect look. So yeah, just like we added the heat treatment gradient to that engineering part before, we can add some production or manufacturer defects with the noise texture. Okay, and now I want to add some scratches to this truck like it has been grinded on. So then in that case, I'll unlink this material. So I have it separated from the base because if we're going to be grinding on this part of the truck, we don't want that projecting through to the base here. So then in this case, we already have a bump map applied to our truck here, but we want to add some more scratches. So in KeyShot 6, we can do this. We can actually add either a separate bump map through the bump add utility, which is found in the material graph, or we can add the scratches as a label, which is what I'll do here. Because I want the scratches to have a different material, or in this case, a different roughness value than the rest of the truck. So KeyShot 6 allows you to essentially blend materials using labels. So to do that, we have our material graph open. Again, material graph is a KeyShot 6 Pro only feature. And what I'll do is I can just grab let's say a polished chrome from our library, drop that into the material graph, and apply that as a label. So you can click and drag on this node output onto the little plus icon, and then it'll apply that as a label. And since I don't have a texture defining the shape of the label, it just gets applied across the entire object or the entire material. So now what I need to do is define the location of that material, and to do that I'll use a procedural texture, in this case the scratches procedural, and assign that as an opacity map. And then you can start seeing the effect. So I'll reduce the directional noise so I have all those scratches going in one direction. Again, in KeyShot 6 Pro, you can use the preview feature to get a clear view of the texture and how we're setting it up here. So maybe increase the density. Increase the thinness. Let's see. Increase the levels to get more scratches in there. That's what I was looking for. So as I mentioned before, the procedural textures do require a little bit of playing around with to find what works for you. So let me exit out of the preview, to see the result here. Actually, I think we want to see, I think we want to invert these colors. And I'll duplicate the scratches and then apply that as a bump map as well. Okay, so now you can see the scratches are all over that part. So we need to define the opacity of those scratches. Actually, that's why it wasn't working. We just defined the bump with the scratches, and we'll define the opacity with a color gradient and preview the color of that. And then we'll add a third stop. And adjust our mapping tool so that we can define the area of those scratches that we want to have shown there. So now we only have the scratches showing on that one section that we defined as white using the color gradient as an opacity map. Somebody asked how I got the scratches into the material graph. There's a number of ways you can do that. So one, which I find the easiest, is just right-clicking in the material graph work area, and then from the textures flyout menu, you have access to all of these procedural textures. And then we can align the nodes to get a more neat view of what we're seeing here. So it is, we are going a little long here. I'm just going to keep going. If there are some more questions, we'll take those before it's too late. Again, a recording of this will be available on youtube.com/KeyShot3D and also at KeyShot.com/learning. So you can view this webinar at any time. If you have to leave, I won't be offended. So let's add some dirt to our wheels here. And we'll use a similar technique with materials on labels because we have this glossy plastic wheel and we want to add kind of a rough dirt patch along the surface that would be in contact with the ground. So we'll open up the material graph, and this is all we have on our material right now, just a basic plastic. And then I can select a texture. In this case, I'll grab the curvature procedural and assign that to the diffuse slot. And what the curvature procedural allows us to do is to define different colors for different levels of curvature on our object. So in this case, we have this flat area or zero curvature area that we want maybe as a brown to represent the dirt. And then we can just set positive and negative curvature to white and start making adjustments to see what works best for this particular object. So we do have two areas of zero curvature. So then I'll have to map that out with an opacity map, similar to what I did with the scratches here, just so we see the dirt on the wheel here. And actually, like I mentioned, we wanted to use materials on labels for this, so we get some varying roughness. So actually, I'll just duplicate this plastic and assign it as a label. And I want this curvature to be assigned to that plastic material so I can change the roughness value. And then, like I mentioned, use the color gradient as an opacity map. Using a similar technique to what I did with the scratches. So I know that I want the center to be opaque and the edges to be transparent. The mapping tool needs to be aligned here. So I can use the position tool or the position option here. And then once I have that relatively centered, then just make adjustments to our gradient to kind of pull out that center. So we can just adjust our stops a little bit. And maybe just scale. All right, so there now we've assigned some dirt using the curvature procedural texture along with the color gradient as an opacity map to define that. So now I want to copy and paste that material over to our other wheel here. So to do that, I just use the hotkeys, which is Shift left click, Shift right click. But for this wheel, we don't want a linked copy. So I'll just do this through the right click menu so it's a little more visual. Copy that material and paste the material rather than pasting the linked material. So now that we have it pasted, our mapping tool is still located over here. So we'll need to make an adjustment to that and just bring it down onto our other wheel. And then we can copy and paste the linked material onto our fourth wheel there. Okay, Sean, are there any questions? Let's see. Remco is asking, can you not delete the curvature and change the color of the duplicated plastic? Yeah, I think I know what he's referring to. I used the curvature procedural to define this patch, but then I used the color gradient as an opacity map. So why wouldn't I just have the so maybe disable the curvature and then change the color of the plastic this as a label as a different material? And yeah, we can definitely do that. But what I liked about the curvature procedural, so let's take a look at what this looks like here. I mean, we could adjust that to bring the gradient out a little more, but then it starts to spill over the edges. Whereas if we have the curvature enabled, since we define these areas of positive and negative curvature as white, then we get some higher contrast values on the edge here. And I think that just gives a little nicer look. But yeah, you can definitely simplify things by just using the plastic material as a basic label with an opacity map. Cool, yeah, that answered the question. Okay. And let's see, ask if we can create an oil texture to the outside of the bearings. So that's an interesting one. Yeah, I think we can do that. So let's take a look at this plastic. We'll just unlink it so we're not changing the other plastics that it's linked to. And so we want kind of an oil texture. So let's say that will be, we'll make it a metal for now. So again, we can use materials on labels in KeyShot 6 along with the material graph to take a metal and assign it as a label. So then let's just change this color, something more oil-like. So now that we have that material applied as a label, we can define the areas we want that to show by using procedural textures. So we have many options here. Perhaps we want to use the occlusion procedural in this case. Assign that as opacity. And then for the areas that are occluded or in shadow, we can have that metal showing through. But actually, in this case, I think I'd like it a little messier. So I'll use the camouflage procedural. This is another one of my favorites. And assign that to the opacity. So then for the values, for a solid white value, that metal texture or metal label will be totally opaque. We can add maybe some spray to soften up the edges, maybe a little roughness. So then we can do that to just add some spots on there. And then this, we can just change this material to anything we like. Like that could be just a diffuse. And there we go. Cool. Glad you like it, Remco. As I mentioned before, if anyone is on KeyShot 5 right now, you can send an email to beta@luxion.com to request the KeyShot 6 beta if you'd like to give it a try yourself. Yeah, so Sandy has a question. Can you blend two procedurals together? Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I'd like to show that with the skateboard deck here. So we have just a plastic material for our deck. Let me make sure this is unlinked. And in the example image or the webinar image that you saw, I had some scratches on the board. So let's add those in. So again, we'll add a label, and to do so, we'll go through the material graph, and I just want this to be a white glossy plastic, and so we'll drop that in as our label. So now we have a nice clean graphic that we're ready to scratch up. Okay, so then we want to combine multiple procedurals here. So to do this, I'll add a utility texture. So in this case, this would be a color composite, and we'll plug that into the diffuse. I'll just open this guy up for reference. Okay, so then for our source, we have some scratches. Okay, and we'll adjust these, reduce the directional noise. We can rotate this so the scratches are going in the right direction. Increase our scale, increase our levels, our density. Okay, and then we can duplicate and assign the same texture to the background. Or actually here we can duplicate our wood and assign it as the inside color. So now we have that wood showing through to our scratches there. And then we can, continue and add. We added another label on here. So actually, this one looks a little better because we have some darkness showing through. So let's take a look at what we did here. So it does get a little complex once you start, combining procedurals and combining textures. So what we have is our scratches defining, so they're actually defining the alpha of the source. The source is just the white plastic. So then we have the brown of the background, which is kind of peeking through to show a little more, and then the wood plugged into the inside color there. Yeah, Remco asked if you duplicate the wood in the material graph, is that still linked? And yes, it is. So, or I should say synced. So then, yeah, definitely something to be aware of. Always check for that sync box, when duplicating and copying textures inside the material graph. Okay, so we've gone way over today. Thank you all for joining us. Keep an eye out in the next few days for this webinar to be posted online. And can't wait to see what you are all able to create with procedural textures and KeyShot 6. All right, thank you.